There's something about being alone in the wilderness that strips away every illusion of control. You realize out there that you are small, that the trees don't care whether you make it back to the trailhead. That sound travels strangely through dense forest, bouncing off ridgelines, swallowed by ravines, arriving from directions that don't quite match where it originated. Most people who hike alone come back with stories about getting turned around, or seeing something they couldn't identify, or hearing something they couldn't explain. They laugh about it afterward, they wave it off, but there's a specific kind of experience that doesn't get laughed off, one that stays with a person for years, quiet and unresolved, something they only mention in hushed settings to people they trust. It involves their own name, spoken by a voice they recognize, from a place where that voice should not be. Tonight, we're going to sit with those experiences. Settle in, because from here on, the story doesn't need to be seen, only heard. Now, put on your headphones. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us where you are right now. What time is it where you're listening? We always find it interesting to know where these stories find people. Story 1. I've told this to maybe 3 people in my life, and every time I do, I watch their expression shift. Not to fear exactly, but to that look people get when something doesn't compute. My name is Drew. I was 26 when this happened. I'd been hiking the Ouachita Trail in Arkansas for about 4 days solo, moving at my own pace, sleeping when I felt like it, not on any strict schedule. It was mid-October. The leaves were turning. The kind of autumn that makes you feel like the world is doing something on purpose. I was about 3 miles east of a shelter I'd stayed at the night before. The morning had been ordinary. Coffee from my camp stove, a protein bar, boots laced up before the light fully arrived. I felt good, rested. The trail was clear and the air smelled like wet wood and pine needles. Around 9 in the morning, I hit a long downgrade through a section of older forest, the kind where the canopy is thick enough that the ground underneath stays dark even on a bright day. I'd been through it before on a previous trip. There was a creek at the bottom you had to rock hop across, and then the trail curved north along a ridge. I knew this stretch. I was about halfway down the slope when I heard it. My name, clear, not shouted. Spoken at a normal conversational volume, the way someone would say it if they were standing a few feet behind you and wanted your attention. Drew. I stopped walking immediately. That's the thing about hearing your name. You can't not stop. It's hardwired. I turned around and looked up the slope behind me. Nothing. The trail was empty as far as I could see. No movement in the trees. I stood still for a moment. My first thought was that there was another hiker somewhere nearby who happened to have the same name, and whoever was with them had called out to them. That's the rational explanation. I held on to it. I started walking again, got maybe 30 yards further. Drew. Same volume, same tone, same direction. Behind me, upslope. I turned again. Still nothing. Here's what I need to explain, because it's the part that I can't attribute to any rational cause. The voice was my mother's. I know my mother's voice the way I know my own face. I've been hearing it my entire life. It has a specific quality. A slight rasp on certain consonants. A cadence that's hers and nobody else's. The voice that said my name on that trail was hers. Not similar. Not resembling. Hers. My mother was, at that moment, at home in Missouri. She was not in the Ouachita Mountains. She had no reason to be there, no way to be there. I had no cell service. I couldn't call her. I stood there on that trail for what felt like several minutes, just listening. The forest was quiet, not silent. There were birds, wind in the upper canopy, the sound of the creek below me. But there was no follow-up, no third call. No rustling that might suggest a person moving through the underbrush. I made a decision that I still think about. I turned around and walked back up the slope. I went about a quarter mile back toward the shelter. I looked around carefully. There was nobody there. No footprints in the soft earth of the trail that weren't my own from earlier that morning. No sign that anyone else had been in that section of forest. I went back down, crossed the creek. I keep thinking. That evening I made camp on the ridge and tried to work through it logically. Sound does strange things in hills and hollows. It bounces. It duplicates. I may have heard someone else's voice distorted by distance and terrain until it sounded like a name. It may have sounded like a name because my brain was primed to hear patterns in noise. That's real. That happens. But the voice. I keep coming back to the voice. 2 days later, when I got back to my car and had a signal again, I called my mother. She was fine. Nothing had happened. She hadn't been thinking about me in any particular way that morning, as far as she knew. I didn't tell her about it. I still haven't. The next story comes from someone else entirely. A different trail, different state, different circumstances, but the same impossible familiarity. Story 2. My therapist says I process things by intellectualizing them, and she's probably right, which is why I want to start by saying that I've considered every logical explanation for what happened to me in the fall of 2019 in the Adirondacks. I've considered acoustics. I've considered hypnagogia, even though I was fully awake. I've considered auditory pareidolia, the phenomenon where the brain constructs recognizable sounds from random noise. I've considered early-stage tinnitus, though I've since been checked and my hearing is fine. I've gone through the list. None of it satisfies me. And I'm the kind of person who usually needs things to be satisfied. I was on a solo section hike of the Northville-Placid Trail. I'd been planning it for 2 years. I took a week off work. I'm a high school biology teacher, and I drove up from Pennsylvania in late September, when the crowds are thinner and the bugs are mostly done. My husband was home with our kids. My mother knew my rough itinerary. I'd done this kind of trip before, not on this trail, but alone in the woods, and I was comfortable with it. Day 3. I was moving through a long corridor of spruce and fir north of Piseco Lake, and the trail had been quiet all morning. I hadn't seen another hiker since the previous afternoon. The sky was overcast, that flat white that makes everything feel a little gray and timeless. I was hiking at a comfortable pace, listening to the sound of my own footsteps when I heard it from somewhere off to my left, off the trail, into the trees. A voice saying my name. Not my trail name, not my last name, my first name, said the way my mother says it when she needs me to pay attention. That particular 2-syllable version with the slight emphasis on the first syllable that she's been using since I was 7 years old. I stopped. I looked into the trees to my left. They were dense. The undergrowth was thick. Waist-high ferns still holding their late-season green, birch and spruce packed closely together. Very little sight line beyond 20 or 30 feet. I said hello. I said it loud enough that anyone in reasonable range would have heard. Nothing. I waited 2 full minutes. I counted. I have a habit of counting when I'm anxious because it gives my brain something to do. Then I started walking again, and the voice said my name a second time, same direction. Slightly further from the trail than before, as if whatever made the sound had moved away from me while I stood still. That detail is the one that got me. Not that I heard it twice, that it seemed to have moved. I did not go into the trees. I want to be clear about that because I think some people would have, out of some combination of curiosity and the instinct to verify. I did not. I kept walking, and I walked faster than I had been walking, and I did not stop for almost an hour. When I made camp that night, I pulled out my journal, which I bring on every trip, and I wrote down exactly what I'd heard and when. The time was 10:14 in the morning. The sky had been overcast. I had eaten breakfast. I had slept adequately the night before. I was not dehydrated. I had not taken any medication. I had no history of auditory hallucinations. The voice was my mother's, not a voice like my mother's. My mother's voice specifically, in the mode she uses when she is trying to reach me through distraction or distance. I called her from a road crossing 2 days later. She was fine. She had not been trying to reach me. She laughed a little when I told her I missed her, which is what I said instead of telling her the truth. I've never gone back to that section of the trail. Another experience. This one is a little different in what came after the voice. Story 3. The honest version of this story is harder to tell than the version I usually give people, which is shorter and ends sooner. I grew up hiking. My dad started taking me when I was 5. By the time I was in college, I was doing long solo trips in the Cascades, and by my late 20s, I'd accumulated enough backcountry miles that I stopped counting. I'm not someone who gets rattled by the wilderness. I'm comfortable in it in a way that's almost structural, like how some people are comfortable in cities. The woods feel like a place I understand, which is part of why this bothers me so much. It was summer, about 7 years ago. I was on the Pacific Crest Trail, southbound through Washington State, about 4 days out of the Canadian border. The terrain through that section is dramatic. Long, open ridges, snowfields lingering into July, and then dense forest in the valley crossings. I was moving well, feeling strong, the kind of trip where everything clicks. Somewhere in the middle of day 4, I came down off a high ridge into a forested drainage. The descent was steep and my knees were starting to feel it, so I was moving carefully, placing my feet deliberately, not looking up much. It was that kind of focused hiking where you're a little inside your own head. I was in a switchback, about to turn, when I heard my name from somewhere below me. Downhill, off the trail, in the trees that filled the drainage floor, maybe 200 feet beneath me. The voice was my mother's. She passed away 4 years before this happened. She died in February, quickly, of a cardiac event. She was 61. We had a complicated relationship, and there are things about her death that I never fully processed because of that complication. And I say that only because I want you to understand that hearing her voice was not simple for me. It wasn't just startling. It landed somewhere much deeper and darker than that. I sat down on the trail, right there on the switchback. I just sat. The call had the sound of her voice when she was trying to catch my attention gently. Not urgent, not alarmed. The way she'd call from another room when she wanted to tell me something, that particular version of my name that she owned. I sat on that switchback for a long time. I don't know how long. The sun moved. The trees below me were quiet. I don't believe in the supernatural in any formal sense. I'm not a religious person. I have a working scientific understanding of how the brain processes sound and how grief can express itself in unexpected ways, especially in solitary, low-stimulation environments. I know all of that. I still can't explain what I heard as anything else. I hiked out the next day. I took the first road crossing I could and hitched into a small town and sat in a diner and drank coffee for 2 hours. I called my sister. I didn't tell her what had happened. I just wanted to hear a voice I recognized in a context that made sense. I've been back to that section of the PCT twice since. I've never heard it again. I'm not sure if that makes it better or worse. The following account is shorter than the others. Sometimes the experiences that stay with us longest are the ones that happened quickly. Story 4. I almost didn't include this one because it's brief and I know how it sounds. But brevity doesn't mean it didn't happen, and I've been thinking about it for 12 years, which is longer than I've thought about most things that have happened to me. I was 19. I had just finished my first year of college. I went on a solo hike in the Smoky Mountains. Just a day hike, nothing ambitious. One of the more popular trails near Gatlinburg. I wanted some time alone after a hard semester. It was a Tuesday in May. The trail was not crowded. I saw maybe 2 other groups in the first couple of miles, and then the trail thinned out, and I had it to myself. I stopped at a viewpoint and ate lunch. I was there for maybe 20 minutes. Then I continued up the trail toward a secondary summit I'd been told had good views. The trail entered heavy forest again after the viewpoint. The light changed, from open sky to filtered green shadow. I'd been walking for about 10 minutes in that forest when I heard my name from somewhere to my right, off the trail, down a slope. The voice was my mother's. She was, at the time, alive and well, and at her job at a dental office in Ohio. I stopped. I listened. I didn't hear it again. That's the whole story. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. But here is what I can't let go of, and this is the part I've turned over in my mind for 12 years. When I heard the voice, before I even consciously registered that it was coming from off the trail, before I processed that it shouldn't be there, my body responded as if to my actual mother calling me. My shoulders turned toward the sound. My chest did something I can only describe as a kind of opening, an anticipatory feeling, like I was about to see someone I loved. And then the understanding arrived that there was no one there, that there couldn't be. That physical memory of my body beginning to move toward a voice is the thing that hasn't faded. I can still feel it, 12 years later. The next experience is from a longer trip. The voice appeared more than once. Story 5. I need to preface this by saying I am not easily unsettled. I work in emergency medicine. I've spent years training myself to stay calm when things go wrong, and that training has transferred, to some degree, into the rest of my life. I don't rattle quickly. This rattled me. 2 summers ago, I attempted a solo traverse in the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana. It's a big, remote place. One of the largest roadless areas in the lower 48 states. No trails in some sections. You navigate by map and compass and the shape of the land. I'd done comparable trips before, including a solo traverse of the Wind Rivers, so I was prepared and experienced. I was 4 days in when it first happened. I was filtering water at a creek in a broad valley. My pack was off, my filter was running, and I was just sitting there watching the water move. Late afternoon. The valley was quiet. No wind to speak of. From the tree line on the far side of the creek, maybe 80 yards away, my name, my mother's voice. I looked up. The tree line was dense lodgepole pine, shadow underneath, nothing visible. I sat absolutely still for a full minute. Nothing moved. The voice didn't come again. I packed up my water filter, put my pack on, and kept moving. I told myself it was nothing. The valley had an unusual acoustic quality. It was long and narrow, and the ridges on either side were steep and close. Sound might do strange things there. I told myself that. Day 6. I was crossing a high pass above tree line, exposed ridge, nothing around me for miles. Wind was significant. 20 miles an hour, maybe more from the northwest. I was moving carefully on loose rock. In a momentary lull in the wind, I heard my name. From behind me, down slope, my mother's voice. I turned. The slope behind me fell away steeply toward a boulder field. Nothing there, nothing moving. There was nowhere to stand on that ridge, nowhere to pause without difficulty, so I kept moving. But my legs were unsteady in a way that wasn't from the terrain. I have a professional relationship with my own physiology. I recognized it as fear. Day 8, the last incident. I was in my tent, not quite asleep, in that state where you're aware of the inside of your eyelids and the sounds of the wilderness at night. A light rain was falling on the tent fabric. I was comfortable. And then my name, from outside the tent. My mother's voice, very close, from the direction of my tent door. I lay completely still. My hand found my headlamp. I turned it on, sat up, unzipped the door. Rain, darkness, empty meadow. I checked around the tent. Soft ground. My own footprints from earlier that evening, going back and forth from the water source. No others. I didn't sleep much after that. I called my mother when I got back to cell range. She was fine. She asked if I had a good trip. I said it was interesting. She's 72 now, and her health has been declining in the last couple of years, and sometimes, when the phone rings late at night, and I see her name on the screen, I feel something I can't fully name. A mixture of love and that other thing, that older thing, from the wilderness. This next account was shared with me by someone who had never told it to anyone before. They asked me to include it without identifying details, which I've honored. Story 6. You have to understand that I grew up in the city. I didn't start hiking until my late 30s, after a divorce and a therapist who suggested I spend more time outdoors. It was not a natural habitat for me. The woods were foreign. I found them both beautiful and unsettling in equal measure. And I think that specific combination is part of why this experience hit me as hard as it did. I was on a solo weekend trip in the Catskills. My second solo trip ever. October, a couple of years ago. I'd planned a 2-night loop, relatively modest mileage, and a well-marked trail. I had done my research and I had proper gear, and I had told people where I would be. I was responsible for it. The first night was fine. Cold, but expected. I made dinner at the shelter, slept okay, woke up early to mist in the valley below the ridge. The second day, I was moving through a long forested section in the early afternoon. The trail descended gradually for several miles through a mix of hardwoods and hemlock. And the light in there had a dim, filtered quality. Not dark, just reduced. Everything is quiet. I heard my name from somewhere ahead of me on the trail. The voice was unmistakably my mother's. I want to try to describe what that recognition feels like from the inside. It's not a reasoning process. You don't think it through. You hear your mother's voice and your nervous system simply knows it the way it knows to breathe. It was her. But here is what made this different from what I've heard others describe. The voice ahead of me sounded tired, not frightened, not urgent. Tired and a little lost. The way she sounds when she has been doing something difficult for too long. Like she needed to sit down, like she was calling to me for help. I stood on the trail with my heart moving at a pace that surprised me, because I am not someone who scares easily, or at least I didn't think I was. I called out. I said her name, actually, which I realize probably tells you something about what my body believed in that moment, even when my mind hadn't caught up. Nothing responded. I kept calling. I walked forward on the trail. I walked off the trail in the direction I thought the voice had come from, pushing through underbrush, calling my mother's name for an amount of time that I am embarrassed to quantify. There was nothing there. No one. I sat down on a log and shook for a while. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I hiked out the rest of the way in about 3 hours and drove home that night, instead of staying for the second night. When I got home, I called my mother. It was late, close to 11. She was confused and a little alarmed that I was calling so late. She was fine. She had been watching television and going to bed. I told her I just wanted to hear her voice. That was the last solo hiking trip I've taken. I don't say that dramatically, I'm just being honest about where things stand. The experience that follows is unusual among these accounts because the person who had it attempted to find an explanation. And what they found made things stranger, not clearer. Story 7. I'm a wildlife biologist by training. I've spent the better part of 15 years working in remote locations. Alaska, the Northern Rockies, parts of Canada. I've logged more hours alone in the backcountry than I could reasonably estimate. I approach unusual experiences with a methodological habit of mind. I want to find the mechanism. So, when I heard my name, my mother's voice, on a solo survey trip in northern Idaho, my first response was to start taking notes. It happened in the morning on the third day of a 5-day survey. I was hiking from a base camp to a series of camera trap sites following a drainage, dense mixed conifer, significant topography, the kind of terrain where you can hear the creek from 3 different angles at once because it bends back on itself through the valley. My name, behind me, my mother's voice. I stopped, and instead of turning around immediately, I closed my eyes and listened. I was trying to identify the acoustic qualities of what I'd heard. Direction, distance, whether it seemed to be reflected or direct. A sound coming directly from a source behaves differently than a sound that's bounced off something. If you're trained to listen, you can sometimes feel the difference. What I heard had felt direct, not bounced, not layered, the way reflected sound is. It came from a specific point in space, a point that was behind me and maybe 40 feet from the trail. I turned and looked. Nothing visible. I waited 5 minutes. Nothing further. I documented the time, the weather conditions, the terrain, the vegetation density, and the approximate distance from the creek. Then I continued to my camera trap sites. On the way back that afternoon, I passed through the same section of trail. I stopped at the approximate location and spent time listening deliberately. The creek was audible, wind was light. There were some bird sounds, a raven somewhere above the canopy, a small flicker working a snag nearby. Nothing that could be my mother's voice. Nothing close. Here is where it gets strange in a different way. When I got back to base camp that evening, I checked the satellite communicator I carry, which my family can use to send me brief text messages. There was a message from my sister, sent that morning at 8:47. The incident with the voice had occurred at approximately 8:50. The message from my sister said that our mother had been taken to the hospital that morning. A fall. She was all right. A hairline fracture in her wrist, nothing life-threatening. She was already home by the time I read the message. But she had been in the emergency room at approximately the time I heard her voice on the trail. I've spent considerable time thinking about what to do with that correlation. As a scientist, I know that correlation is not causation. I know that timing coincidences occur. I know that 3 minutes is within the margin of my time estimation error in the field. I also know what I heard, and I know what time the message was sent. I don't have a conclusion. I've made my professional life around the necessity of conclusions, and I don't have one for this. I've just filed it the way you file things that don't fit anywhere. Carefully, and somewhere you can find it again. The next story is from a group hike that became a solo situation. This wasn't supposed to be a solo trip. That's what I always start with when I tell this story. Not because it changes anything, but because I think it's important. I was with people, and then I wasn't. And I was fine with that. And then something happened that made me wish very much that someone else was present. I was hiking in the White Mountains with 2 friends the summer before last. We'd planned a 2-day loop in the Pemigewasset wilderness, which is a big, heavily forested interior section without many roads. Both friends were experienced. We all knew what we were doing. On the second morning, one of my friends woke up with symptoms that turned out to be a kidney stone. Not life-threatening, but genuinely miserable, and she needed to get out. My other friend hiked out with her to drive her to urgent care. I was closest to the far end of the loop, and it made more logistical sense for me to complete the circuit and meet them at the far trailhead. We had a plan. We had communication devices. It was fine. I had about 8 miles to cover, and I was moving at a steady pace. The day was overcast, the trail was wet from rain the night before, but I was comfortable and well supplied. 3 miles from the trailhead, the trail descended through a long hardwood section. Beech trees mostly. The forest floor was open under them. Beeches shade out the understory, so I had good sight lines for a change. I could see between the trees for 100 yards in most directions. I was moving through that open section when I heard my name from the trees to my left. Far enough off the trail that whoever was calling would have been visible from where I stood, given the sight lines under those beeches. There was no one there. The voice was my mother's, not uncertain, not faint. Clear and near and completely hers. I stood still. I could see a long way through those trees, not just 20 or 30 feet, 100 feet, maybe more. The forest floor was covered in pale beech leaves from previous years. There was no undergrowth to hide in. If a person had been standing there and calling my name, I would have seen them. There was no person. I want to stress this because the other accounts I've heard usually involve dense forest, limited sight lines, the possibility of someone concealed nearby. This was an open forest. I had a clear view. There was no one. I said hello into the empty trees because I couldn't help myself. My voice came back to me slightly, off the trunks. Quiet, small. I stood there for a full minute. Then I hiked the remaining 3 miles as fast as I could without running. My friends were at the trailhead when I arrived. My friend with the kidney stone was pale and unhappy, but stable. I helped load the gear and we drove to the hospital, and I sat in the waiting room and I didn't mention to anyone what had happened in the beech forest. Because the setting was wrong and the mood was wrong, and also I didn't have any language for it that didn't sound unhinged. I still don't, really, but I know what I saw, which was nothing, and I know what I heard, which was everything. Sometimes these experiences are shared between people. The next account involves 2 hikers who heard the same thing. Story 9. My brother and I have talked about what happened maybe a dozen times in the years since it happened. We don't come to different conclusions. We don't offer each other different explanations. We mostly just confirm what we both remember, and then we sit with it. We were hiking together in the Boundary Waters area in northern Minnesota. Not a wilderness area with trails, exactly, more of a portage and paddle system, but we were doing a stretch on foot between 2 lakes following an old portage path that had largely reverted to forest. We were on a week-long trip, the 2 of us, and we'd been out for 4 days. The weather had been perfect. The portage path was narrow, single file, and we were walking that way, my brother ahead of me. We'd been mostly quiet, the kind of comfortable silence you can only have with someone you know very well. We were a few hundred yards into the portage when my brother stopped abruptly. I almost walked into him. He turned and looked at me. His expression was something I'd never seen on him before. My brother is older than me, and he is the kind of man who maintains composure as a point of identity. His expression was unsettled. He said quietly, "Did you just hear that?" I had. That's the answer. I had just heard it. We had both heard our mother's voice. Our mother, who we shared, obviously. The same woman, the same voice. She called my name first, then my brother's name, in that order. The way she used to call us for dinner when we were kids, from somewhere downstairs or outside. Both names in sequence. The voice came from off the portage path to our right, into the trees, toward the lake we hadn't reached yet. We stood on that path for a long time. We didn't talk. We looked at each other. We looked into the trees. Nothing moved. The voice did not come again. Our mother had been gone for 2 years by then. She died of cancer. We'd both been with her at the end. She was the kind of woman who would have worried about the 2 of us, out in the wilderness together, which is not relevant to anything, but it keeps coming back to me when I think about this. We completed the portage without talking much, set up camp at the next lake, made dinner. That night, sitting by the fire, my brother said, "I don't think we need to explain it. I think we can just let it be what it was. I've tried to live by that. Some days, it works better than others." The following account involves what happened after the voice, a choice made on the trail that the person has been second-guessing ever since. Story 10. I've replayed the decision I made probably hundreds of times, not the hearing of it. That part is fixed. I know what I heard, but the decision about what to do afterward, that's the part that still runs in the background. I was 3 days into a solo trip in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. It's not the most dramatic wilderness. No big peaks, no dramatic terrain, but it's big and quiet, and the trail system is extensive enough that you can get genuinely alone if you know where to go. I knew where to go. I was on a route I'd done twice before, which meant I was moving with a certain relaxed confidence, knowing what the terrain ahead looked like, not needing to watch the map constantly. That familiarity, I think, made what happened stranger. This was known ground. There shouldn't have been anything there that I didn't expect. I heard my name from off the trail, my mother's voice, not calling with urgency, but with a kind of beckoning quality. The way she'd say it when she wanted me to come look at something, a bird she'd spotted from the porch, or something she'd found in the garden, the tone of gentle invitation rather than demand. Come here, that's what her voice always implied when she used that tone. I found something. Come see. I was so struck by the tone of it, that specific, particular quality, that I actually took several steps off the trail before I fully processed what I was doing. I was walking toward the sound, through the underbrush. The brush closed behind me. I stopped. I looked back at the trail. I could still see it through the vegetation. I was only 6 or 8 feet off it. I looked ahead of me in the direction I'd been walking. The forest was dense, darker away from the trail, the ground uneven, no path. I called out. I said, "Mom," which I am not embarrassed to admit. Silence. Then, from further ahead, further into the trees, away from the trail, I heard it a second time. My name, her voice, faint but clear, a little further away, as though she had moved deeper in, and I made my decision. I turned around. I went back to the trail. I have thought about that decision constantly. On the one hand, it was the sensible choice. You don't leave marked trails in unfamiliar forests to chase voices, and I know that. On the other hand, there are days when I feel a pull I can't account for, a sense that I turned away from something at the moment I should have stayed, that there was something there. I don't know what there was. I know what I heard, and I know what I chose, and I live with both. A short account submitted by someone who only wanted to share one specific detail. Story 11. I'm going to keep this brief because I don't have much to add to the description of what happened, but there's a specific detail that I haven't seen mentioned anywhere else, and I wanted it to be part of the record. I was hiking in the Great Smoky Mountains, alone, in the spring of 3 years ago. I heard my name from off the trail. The voice was my mother's. This much is identical to many accounts I've heard. The specific detail is this: when I heard the voice, and I have near perfect pitch and a strong auditory memory, both of which are relevant. The voice was not my mother as she sounds now. She's in her 70s. Her voice has changed the way all voices change with age. A little thinner, a little more careful. The voice I heard on the trail was my mother as she sounded when I was a child, in her 30s or early 40s. When she was young, her voice had a fullness and strength that I'd forgotten. Almost, until I heard it again on that trail. She's still alive. She doesn't know I heard this. I don't know what to do with it. I don't think there's anything to do with it. I just wanted that detail noted somewhere. The final account in tonight's collection is the one that was most difficult to include because of what it implies about what happens when you don't come back to the trail. Story 12. I've been hiking for 30 years. I have a rule I've kept for all of them. When you're uncertain about terrain or conditions, you stop. You don't push through uncertainty. You wait it out or you turn back. That rule has kept me safe across a lot of miles and a lot of years. The one time I came closest to breaking that rule, it was because of voice. I was on a solo trip in the North Cascades, 5 days in, on a route that included a high traverse between 2 drainages. The traverse required good weather. It crossed an exposed ridge above 12,000 feet, and there was a section where a slip would be serious. I'd been watching the weather carefully, and the forecast was favorable. In the morning I was supposed to do the traverse. The weather was not what had been forecast. Not dramatically bad. Not a storm. But there was low cloud, restricted visibility, and the ridge would be icy. Not impossible, but pushing the edge of my rule. I made camp and waited to see if it would clear, but by mid-morning it hadn't. I was sitting outside my tent, assessing, genuinely on the fence about whether to attempt the traverse or take the longer route down and around. That's when I heard my name from above me, upslope, from the direction of the traverse, my mother's voice. And here's the thing I need to be careful about, because what I felt in that moment was not just the strangeness and confusion I'd heard others describe. What I felt was a pull, a suggestion, as if the voice were saying, "Come this way, come up, this is the direction, you should go." I sat with that feeling for several minutes. I want to be honest that I felt it. I'm not sure what it means about human psychology, or about whatever makes these sounds an empty wilderness, but the voice in my mother's tone, coming from the direction of a route I was considering but uncertain about, created in me a genuine impulse to stand up and begin the traverse. I didn't. My rule held. I took the long route around. It added 6 hours and cost me the summit I'd been building toward, but I made it out in good conditions, and I was fine. I'd gone back and forth on what the voice was. On one hand, it could have been nothing. Random sound, brain noise, the particular auditory vulnerability of days alone in the wilderness. On the other hand, if it was nothing, I happened to encounter it at a moment when following it would have been dangerous. I don't know if that's meaningful. I don't know if anything in this category of experience is meaningful, or if meaning is something we impose on things that simply happen. But I know that if I had stood up and followed that voice up into the clouds and ice, I would not have had anyone to blame but myself. And I know that the voice sounded exactly like the person who, more than anyone in my life, would not have wanted me to take that risk. I'm not sure what to do with that. There isn't a clean explanation waiting at the end of these accounts. If you were hoping for one, I understand. So was I, the first time I gathered stories like these. What you find, instead, is a consistency that doesn't have an easy home in either the rational or the supernatural category. People alone in the wilderness. Voices they would recognize above any others. A name spoken by someone who cannot be there. And then silence. The forest doesn't offer explanations. It offers silence and distance and the sound of your own breathing, and occasionally something else that you spend years trying to file in the right place. Some of these people have found a way to set it down. Others are still carrying it. If you've had an experience that belongs in this collection, you already know what it feels like to tell it to someone for the first time. That mix of relief and fresh uncertainty, the story becoming real again in the telling. You know that some things don't resolve, and that the not resolving is its own kind of answer. Go carefully out there, and if you hear your name, just for a moment before you do anything else, stand still and listen to what the silence says next.